Excellent. Thank you. Um, okay. Thank you, Erin. So I'm going to be presenting some work today on uh, about governing digital public goods under conditions where they're being contested and even subject to attack by certain actors. And I'm really excited because this is a lot of this work is kind of in progress, and a lot of it is at a conceptual level as I prepare for my dissertation proposal. So I'm really looking forward to feedback and discussion with you all. And I'm going to start at the beginning of the year when Elon Musk set his sights on Wikipedia. And on his social media platform, X, he accused Wikipedia of being an extension of legacy media propaganda and called for it to be defunded. And the catalyst for this was that there was this new paragraph in a Wikipedia article dedicated to him. At Donald Trump's second inauguration, Musk had given a speech during which he made this gesture that many people noticed looked just like a Nazi salute. So the volunteer editors of Wikipedia had edited his article accordingly, taking note of the public commentary and reactions to the gesture. And of course, Musk took issue with that and characterized it as evidence of Wikipedia's anti-conservative bias. So these attacks, these sorts of allegations against Wikipedia are not particularly new. Wikipedia has long faced allegations of perceived liberal bias in its content. You may be familiar, for example, for Conservapedia, which is a right-wing kind of alternative to Wikipedia that runs the same underlying MediaWiki software that has existed since 2007, although it's not as popular as Wikipedia. But over the past couple of months, these right-wing attacks have kind of escalated as part of this broader campaign. On X, for example, the operator of the anti-trans Libs of TikTok account started attacking the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the organization that is behind the online encyclopedia, for its investment in DEI initiatives. And then a leaked report revealed that the Heritage Foundation, the conservative think tank responsible for the Project 2025 agenda, that is the blueprint for the second Trump administration, had devised this campaign to identify and target Wikipedia editors. And in response to these threats, the foundation actually announced that for the first time, it would be rolling out anonymity, preserving and anti-harassment features on the English Wikipedia that it had previously reserved for authoritarian countries that had placed restrictions on freedom of speech and access to information. So these are the kind of the argument I'm trying to make is that these are not just content level disputes over facts. We know that Wikipedia is now kind of critical knowledge infrastructure. It's in addition to being one of the most visited websites in the world, it powers many other parts of the internet that rely on its knowledge base. You may have noticed, for example, when you search for something like QAnon on YouTube, a Wikipedia card pops up at the top. Generative AI companies rely on Wikipedia's article base as a source of training data for LLMs, and there are many other such cases of the interdependency between Wikipedia and other parts of the internet. So Elon Musk's attack on Wikipedia is what I'm going to refer to as a legitimacy attack. It's an effort to undermine public confidence in the information resource itself through these meta-level criticisms of its processes, of its funding, or of its cultural or political biases. And that's kind of different from direct content manipulation, because it's not really targeting the content itself, it's targeting the perceived credibility and the authority of the underlying resource system. And I think there are other kinds of attacks that I would place into this category of more systematic threats that are not just affecting content, but are affecting the system. So just this week, Casey Newton published a newsletter on how AI scrapers are taxing Wikipedia's bandwidth by hammering the site, and the Wikimedia Foundation published a blog post, I think, about how it's trying to address this with changes to how it manages its API. As another example, off of Wikipedia, there's a lot of emerging evidence that the adoption of LLMs decrease incentives for volunteer contribution to online knowledge forums like Stack Overflow and even Reddit. And even beyond kind of online platforms, fact-checking organizations are being attacked in some of these same systematic ways that we've seen kind of online knowledge commons being attacked, attacks to their legitimacy. And I've been thinking a lot about what frameworks we can use to think about or analyze these attacks on information goods that are not just about manipulating content, but are about targeting these underlying systems, the infrastructure that makes these knowledge goods even possible to provision. So next, I want to talk about two bodies of research that I've been engaging with and thinking about in particular with regard to this question: how should we think about systematic attacks on information commons? The first area is this kind of coalescing field of work examining misinformation and disinformation. And I've been in this area kind of for a bit of time before I came to UW. And originally when I got into it, I think it was a bit less contested. Post Russian election interference, I think there was a lot of focus on foreign disinformation, countering influence operations online, taking down and disrupting networks of inauthentic accounts, etc. But more recently, there has been increasing criticism of academic policy and government efforts to counter disinformation. And there have been more than a few articles making a very similar kind of bundle of arguments that, well, you can't really study misinformation. It makes no sense because it's just symptomatic of other problems like polarization or racism, as well as this related bundle of critiques that the entire industry of people who are studying this problem are kind of biased and kind of illegitimate. And with some of my colleagues last year, I wrote a piece that responded to some of this and said, well, these critiques kind of fail to accurately represent the field that they're critiquing. They focused a lot on these studies that were kind of identifying content as true or false, but in reality, a lot of the research in this field is much more complicated. It's looking at sense making and rumors and how people make sense of information, and isn't really putting information in these true or false kinds of binaries. And I still think that's true. But since we got into this kind of debate last year, I've been reflecting on it more. And I think this entire debate kind of has something missing, which is that, well, misinformation, disinformation research, I'm going to paint broadly here, falls into kind of a few buckets. There's research on empowering individuals at the micro level, kind of looking at content individuals, empowering them through media literacy, pre-bunking efforts. You may have heard of some inoculation theory, which kind of proposes that you can vaccinate people against misinformation by exposing them to false content before. So I would place that at like those are these kinds of micro level interventions targeting individuals and content. Then there's this macro level, and this is kind of where a lot of some of my earlier work has fallen, and things that I've been thinking about earlier, these like platform-wide interventions, making algorithmic changes to platforms, removing networks of bad actors. I would place a lot of discussions about regulatory approaches at the national level and at the international level, at this macro kind of layer of analysis as well. But then there's largely this neglected layer, which is the meso level, the underlying resource system and governance, and how do you protect, there's very little research characterizes misinformation or disinformation research that actually looks at protecting community governance mechanisms, as well as addressing threats to legitimacy and trust in the resource system itself, rather than focusing just on, for example, content manipulation. And so some of my recent work with my advisor, Benjamin Mako-Hill, has focused on this layer. So in a recent study published it's in CSCW last year, we looked at the Croatian Wikipedia, which, if you're not familiar with the Croatian Wikipedia, it was captured by a small group of far-right nationalists who were essentially Nazi sympathizers for a period for about a decade, who inserted a bunch of kind of historical revisionism into the articles of the project that were really sympathetic to the World War II collaborationist government that was collaborating with the Nazis. And they also blocked and kind of harassed dissenting editorial voices. So that was the case on Croatian Wikipedia for more than a decade. It's very well documented, and there's a Wikimedia Foundation report on it. But what we were interested in was, why did Croatian Wikipedia succumb to this capture when adjacent language editions not? And for background, Serbo-Croatian is a pluricentric language, and it actually has 4 national variants, and they each have associated Wikipedia language edition. But only Croatian was captured to this extent. So we conducted an interview study, and based on that, we kind of came up with these 3 propositions: that Croatian was captured because it was valuable as a target. It had enough of an audience, also tied to a national identity, but it was bureaucratically rather closed. It wasn't easy for people to ascend to positions in a transparent way, positions of elevated rights. And it also preferred these personalistic, informal forms of organization over formal ones. So kind of this is a conceptual model that we put in the paper, and the idea was basically that Croatian Wikipedia fell in this this rightmost matrix. It fell into the left quadrant of having both personalistic institutions and a really insular bureaucracy. So that's kind of an example of research that I think looks at that meso layer. But the second body of research that I've been thinking a lot about is this rich tradition on public goods and commons governance. And unlike a lot of the disinformation research, this literature is really focused on the meso layer. Scholars like Eleanor Ostrom, for example, have studied how communities develop these institutions and norms to sustainably manage shared resources. And more recently, work in this area has expanded to information commons like open source software, collaborative knowledge bases, and other kinds of digital public goods. But as I've kind of thought more and more about this area of work, I've kind of come to the conclusion that it's mostly focused still on addressing collective action problems in non-adversarial settings, where people generally have a shared collective goal. In some of the initial commons research, they are even inhabiting the same plot of land for generations. So they have really, really developed norms of reciprocity and interdependence that have developed over long periods of time. So they're not while this literature does talk about risks like appropriation, it does not necessarily talk about them in the context of really adversarial dynamics. So I'm going to propose that as information goods mature, they actually become subject to these adversarial dynamics in a way that they're not necessarily subject to earlier on in their kind of life cycle. Um, and the idea is that I made this graph to illustrate that concept. As the good matures, right, it increases in value, and the resource system that it sustains kind of becomes more complex. And as a result, the primary governance challenges that information goods and the communities that steward them face kind of evolve. Something like free riding, which is the focus of a lot of like the public goods literature, becomes less of a concern as the resource system evolves, and the initial hurdle of attracting contributors is cleared. But as the good matures, it becomes more valuable, and the governance systems haven't necessarily evolved alongside it to protect it sufficiently. And this is kind of when a threat like governance capture becomes most salient. So this is what happened with Croatian Wikipedia. But then once information commons and information goods past that intermediate stage, they become they're not yet out of the wood. They become subject to probably the most advanced kind of attack, I think, which is these legitimacy attacks by outside actors, where, okay, maybe Elon Musk can't necessarily capture the internal mechanisms and governance processes of Wikipedia as a whole, because it's really well developed bureaucratically and quite resilient overall to that kind of capture. But he can undermine public trust or goodwill towards the resource. And that's where that's where a lot of more mature information goods, those are the kinds of threats that these more mature information goods are facing now. So I wanted to just conclude by offering some ideas based on these concepts for the stewards of online communities. And based on what I've talked about, there are three things that stand out to me as potentially helpful, and I'd love to talk about them more. The first is that to identify the distinct public goods that a community stewards. I think there is a lot of focus on content or information as the main good within these commons. So like, for example, in Wikipedia, a lot of people think about the good as the articles, the encyclopedic knowledge base. But the governance systems itself are also a good, and as kind of we saw in the governance capture example, they're also very, very attractive for motivated actors trying to target them. And related to that, it's important to distinguish between different types of attacks on different elements of the resource system. There's a difference between attempts to manipulate content or essentially pollute the information resource, and attempts to capture governance mechanisms. And those kinds of attacks may require very different kinds of responses. And finally, I think it's important to look at adjacent governance systems around you. There are online communities that are really similar in many ways, but that are experimenting with different governance arrangements, and there's quite a bit of variation in terms of which ones succeed and which ones don't. And that was kind of the idea behind the Croatian Wikipedia study. And I think some comparison of those successes and failures might be one way towards kind of developing strategies for more resilient community governance. So I'm excited to discuss any of these more. I wanted to thank Mako for helping me develop a lot of these ideas. And yeah.
There we go. We're being recorded. So next up, we have Professor Paul Gowder, who is joining us today from the so far away from where I'm sitting on the north side of Chicago, Pritzker School of Law at Northwestern University. where he is a his expertise encompasses a wide and teaching and research interests encompass a wide number of areas, including constitutional law, political theory, critical race theory, and technology. Um, of particular relevance to this event and this group, he has consulted with Facebook on election integrity and the oversight board a number of years back, and was a founding fellow and board member with the Integrity Institute, um, and is a former civil rights and legal aid lawyer, as well as the author of 3 books, all of them available under open access licenses, and you can get to them via his website, which we can drop into the chat. And the most recent of which, published in 2023, is the Networked Leviathan, published by Cambridge University Press, which I think caught the attention of a lot of us in the community data science collective, in part because I think more than a lot of other work that I've encountered in this area, really tries to pursue meaningful propositions for democratic platform governance. Um, and I think that's something that a lot of people don't or aren't willing to take seriously, but something that I think is really, as I said at the outset, really an urgent challenge, and absolutely centrally relevant to the conversations we've just been having. So I think before we had the event, Zarine joked that she was gonna like identify all the problems, and Paul would then have to figure out how to fix them. So with that, we'll turn it over to you, Paul, and wish you good luck.
Yeah, I feel like I really need good luck for that. I mean, particularly because I'm in a way like sort of what I want to do is try to figure out like what the research agenda for platform governance sort of 2.0 is. And this is really, I mean, this is totally extemporaneous right now, by the way. Like there's no slides. I have no real plan except to kind of lead us into this space of reflection. And it really starts. I'll sort of tell you the story of this book and why I no longer believe that it's right in many of its core assumptions. So, fall of 2023, right? I published this book, and a lot of my thinking of it really comes from this experience inside of Facebook. And so, and that experience is mostly in 2018 and 2019, like when it's still called Facebook rather than Meta because Mark Zuckerberg gets obsessed with funny looking glasses. And like there was this there was this team called Civic Integrity, and like in a lot of ways it was one of the most high functioning teams I've ever seen. And there was just an extraordinary amount of talent and an extraordinary amount of genuine goodwill that was really gathered in that room. And this was like, in response to the problems of 2016, when sort of people woke up at one point and said, oh shit, we did Trump. And Facebook really like stepped up to the plate in a fairly strong way, stood up all these so-called integrity teams. And those teams, again, I mean, they did like genuinely good work. Yeah, I probably can't say the details, but I mean, I do know how Alex Jones got kicked off of Facebook, for example, back in the day when Alex Jones getting kicked off of a Facebook was the thing. Um, and then I remember, at around this time, a lot of other companies were innovating in like governance, even faster and more effectively. Twitter, for example, was doing kind of proto-democratic things. Like Twitter was sort of genuinely at least reaching out to the community and creating all kinds of councils. I mean, obviously this is pre-Elon. And similarly, it's like a genuine attempt to sort of get hold of the problem of platform governance. And like premise one of this book that I did in 2023 was, okay, like there's a business reason for this. And the business reason was some combination of the old evidence that we had for platform death spirals, and essentially, a lot of there was some work back about MySpace, and Friendster and platforms like that that did experience death spirals, combined with the observation that, during the pre-Trump period, or at least the sort of called the Trump interregnum period, during the interregnum period, there was a ton of movement from advertisers about problems of content moderation. There were multiple like advertiser boycotts of YouTube. There was genuine worry, I think, that advertisers would be unwilling to confront the kind of brand safety problems that they were exposed to on platforms with bad content moderation. And like more broadly, there was at least some reason to think that the business models of the major privately owned platforms, your Facebooks, your Twitters, so on and so forth, were intertwined in some meaningful sense with functioning, like existent liberal democracy. That, the idea of domains for interpersonal communication where people could actually conduct politics in at least a semi-healthy way, were not exposed to like the most toxic ideas that you can ever imagine on a regular basis. Like these things seemed fairly strongly in companies' business interests. And so I wrote this book sort of based on the premise that there was an alignment of interest between companies and the general public, at least partially, and on the idea that the real problem was effectiveness. In other words, the real problem was twofold. Problem number one is companies had challenges aligning their short-term and their long-term incentives with respect to things like pressure from governments across the world. Problem number two is companies just had a really difficult time figuring out, under conditions of diversity and high-speed change, precisely what rules were needed to actually achieve their economic and social ends on these platforms. And, the sort of quintessential example of the latter being the, perennial question, what do we do about the Thai law against defaming the monarchy? Right? I mean, that's the example that gets trotted out in company circles sort of over and over and has been in for years, I guess decades at this point, because it's like kind of exemplifies the sort of problem I was thinking about, where on the one hand, there's like a genuine problem of cultural diversity, where we don't actually think that Americans should be the regulators of, what the Thai norms are about communicating against the monarchy. But then at the same time, there are also genuine worries about, for example, the democratic fidelity of how these laws are used. And so, in this book, brought together a lot of the stuff we've already talked about. I brought together some of the Ostrom ideas about commons governance. I brought together a bunch of ideas from folks like Friedrich Hayek about information problems. And I made the argument that not only would it be a good idea, but there was a sense in which it might be genuinely politically and economically possible to see a move to democratic governance institutions in and for private companies that control these huge chunks of the information ecosystem. Like the essential claim was, it's in companies' economic interest to do this work better. The best way to do this work better is to genuinely create global democratic institutions that can do this at a grassroots level. We do have, or we did have at the time, maybe we still do, some credible regulators that can nudge companies to choosing these sorts of solutions, particularly in the European Union. And, here's a sketch for how we might build that thing. That all seems really optimistic right now, doesn't it? I might even go so far as to say that it seems Pollyanna-ish. The reason that it seems Pollyanna is, I mean, at the time, I mean, I wrote that book like as Elon was sort of destroying Twitter, and some I thought was, okay, when you're the richest guy in the world, like Twitter's maybe, a fifth of his net worth. I guess when you're a mega billionaire, you can light a fifth of your net worth on fire for fun. Economic incentives just don't apply to Musk. I'll carve that case out and look at what, places like Alphabet and Meta still seem to be trying to do. And then Trump 2.0 happens, and all of a sudden, the entire technology industry seems to publicly surrender anything like an expressed commitment to the ideals of liberal democracy. I mean, Mark Zuckerberg goes on Joe Rogan and talks about masculine energy. Um, and, Julie Cohen, who, for I don't know how many folks pay close attention to the legal scholars in the technology field, but Julie Cohen has been circulating this really, like, I think, scary but fascinating and convincing paper about oligarchy. And to my mind, Julie's paper maybe amounts to a better understanding of the incentives of many of these companies than the understanding that I thought that I had back in 2023. And essentially, Julie's understanding is that I'm going to sort of translate this into more Paul terms as opposed to Julie terms. But as I understand her understanding, the basic idea is number one, these companies are increasingly diversified into things that don't require so much consent of ordinary people and participation of ordinary people to go forward. I think number two, these companies can engage in enough regulatory capture that even if they still, in some sense, rely on usage by ordinary people and even usage by other companies, such as advertisers of their products, that they no longer necessarily need to have sort of complete buy-in from ordinary people or other companies from the products, given the amount of influence that they have over governments and the amount of control they have over the markets they operate in, up to and including the control in some cases that these companies are acquiring over baseline internet infrastructure like cables and satellites. And so the question that I want to pose, and this really is a question, is sort of how do we think about the project of democratic governance of privately controlled information ecosystem under such circumstances, that is, under circumstances of intense regulatory capture, number one, and number two, likely, like as I think Julie's probably right, likely a significantly weakened capacity for market discipline, even in the sort of network collapse death spiral sense that existed with earlier platforms to discipline these companies. And, so there's a few the pathways that I think people are thinking. Pathway number one is essentially, well, there are still some large markets with regulatory capacity, right? The EU still exists, Australia, such as it is, still exists, Brazil still exists. And unlike the United States, unlike India, those countries, at least or those, in case of the EU regions, still have something like credible governments. And so in that sense, sort of platform governance simply becomes subsumed into international economic competition, right? And when we're seeing elements of this now, in the news recently, for example, are stories about Meta turning to Trump in order to try to seek diplomatic pressure to undo various kinds of potential sanctions levied by the EU. And so, in that sense, I think we can start to imagine that the problem of platform governance becomes a form of intergovernment cooperation. And the other dimension that a lot of people are thinking about is, sort of more dispersed grassroots commonsy kind of creations is essentially the notion that, maybe some version of the Mastodon Fediverse experiment, only much more accessible to ordinary human beings than the Mastodon Fediverse experiment ever was, combined with some kind of capacity to actually recruit ordinary users to participate in alternative platform economies, even if they can't undermine the market power of the major companies, at least might provide individuals with some kind of alternatives and provide a site for experimentation, albeit at the relatively small scale, in some of the governance forms that I and scholars like Zarine have been thinking about for a long time. But neither of these feel terribly satisfactory, right? I mean, the one sort of feels like, hey, so we're just like, there isn't a field of platform governance anymore. There's just international relations. It's all international relations. Great. Um, Solution two amounts to, well, you're mad at your grocery store, go start a co-op farmers market. And, while you're mad at your grocery store, go start a co-op farmers market is a perfectly valid thing to think. It does, in a lot of senses, ignore substantial market realities. And, in a way, I think particularly for those outside countries with substantial infrastructure, with substantial educational infrastructure, human capital, communications infrastructure. I think that solution probably feels like an identification of privilege more than anything else. Like if you're, a team of hackers, congratulations, enjoy Mastodon. If you're a bunch of, American university professors, move over to Blue Sky and then move over to the next thing. Everybody else gets to be told by their crazy uncle that you need to inject horse tranquilizer to cure COVID. Um, and so I feel like I'm really at a loss. And I feel like I'm kind of expressing this sense of at a loss. If it's the case that there isn't actually a basic alignment of company interests with the rest of our interests, then maybe we should shut the field down, at least with respect to thinking about privately controlled platforms. Maybe we should really just, I mean, I'm already a political scientist, but I mean, maybe everybody else should either focus on Wikipedia or become a political scientist and focus on nation states again. That's my expression of sort of existential angst for us today.
All right, I guess you're not going to solve everything.
No.
Fine.
Or
Uh,
indeed anything.
no, but that was fantastic. And I really appreciate you kind of bringing in the Cohen piece, um, and trying to really think big about broadly, like what are the incentives, what is the power structure, what are the different overlapping power structures that are involved here, um, and to the extent that, I mean, what I hear, I think, in some of your kind of characterization of the initial state of things in 2019 when you were starting to work on the book, um, it has a little bit of this like we had all drank the Fukuyama end of history we were still sipping on the Kool-Aid, right? The end of history
Yeah.
Kool-Aid, which was like really relying on the incentives of liberal democratic capitalism to essentially solve what turns out to be a deep and sticky set of problems that some creative oligarchs have found a way around the things that we thought would constrain them.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's like a lot there.